Hello.
Our story begins in deep space. Lord Vader was trailing a group of Jedi per his master's instructions. Among these Jedi were a former archivist from an old Jedi outpost. Sidious hoped to gain information from keys that might belong to this master. During the days of the Clone Wars, data had been stored at different Jedi caches around the galaxy, and one of the leading archivists studying under Jocasta Nu had been sent to this location. Vader's spies had zeroed in on a Jedi, and thus he was going to intercept them for a chance to slaughter them. Whatever his master wanted from them wasn't much of a concern to Vader, because his thrill at this early stage into his Sith career was killing Jedi. He was after revenge. It's what he craved more than anything, and the Jedi, more than Sidious, were deserving of equal pain of what they put him through. The Dark Lord crossed the stars in hopes that he might find these Jedi, but his trail continuously ran cold. All the while, traveling inside of an Imperial shuttle, he thought of how he might grow his power. Vader's solitude remained one of the defining characteristics of these early months as a Sith. He spent much time in his own head, and whether that was by design or not, he was unsure. The Dark Lord simply knew that he existed within the context of his master's empire. Sidious kept a tight chain around Vader's neck, like the Zygerians did their slaves, but it wasn't a connection he had made yet in his own mind. The man inside, Anakin Skywalker, hadn't fully crossed into evil yet. His crystal may have been bled, despite his struggles, and he may have certainly felt called to return to his former instructors through various visions, but he couldn't. The rings of hyperspace continued to pass by and reflect off of his helmet, and he closed his eyes. He thought back to the massacre at the Jedi Temple, and what he had done to prove himself to his new master. Vader enjoyed the hunt. Killing the Jedi was his greatest thrill, but he couldn't kill them forever, and when he was finished hunting them, what would become of him? His lust for revenge was being quenched, but forever would it not stand. Vader decided to think of this later, fearing that he could seek to betray his master, something that wouldn't bode well for him. He had already learned what Palpatine was capable of. Whether it be his own torture that he suffered or the death of Windu, Vader knew that Sidious could do whatever he wanted to him. When the Imperial shuttle broke out of hyperspace, he sped down towards a colorful orb just outside the Greater Javin. The planet of Dola wasn't far from the gas giant Bespin, but it's where the scout troopers reported seeing the escaping Jedi. Vader wasn't pleased with the idea of working with these TK troopers. These weren't technically TK stormtroopers, but it was still odd collaborating with regular citizens inside of black Phase 2 armor. He thought of these humans as lesser. Anakin Skywalker wouldn't regard a citizen as such, especially not the clones he served with, but his philosophy had to change, and it did. He viewed clones and stormtroopers in the same light, which didn't align with how much General Skywalker adored his elite troopers. Vader's shuttle crept down under the tree line and hid behind a rock formation. The Dark Lord exited and ran face first into the squad. They reported that a Jedi cache was hidden on the planet somewhere, but the Jedi that the Emperor wanted him to find were inside of a ship. Where, they did not know. Per the troopers' intel, the ship was also hidden within the forest, which didn't really provide much relief, though they confirmed that the other half of their squad was actively searching the forest for it. The lead of the squad told Vader that she could give him the holographic display for the other troopers in their squad if he wanted. He shook his head, telling the trooper and her squad to remain steadfast. It would best serve their time assisting the rest of their squad. Darth Vader started walking past them as he finished his sentence, which ordered them to split up and continue searching. There was no reason to combine their efforts in the same concentrated area without gaining any results. If they could use their size and different locations to their advantage, then perhaps they could actually find the Jedi. The next several hours would have Vader trekking through the forest. The jungle was vibrant with life, so much abundance that should be squashed. The edginess of Vader's demeanor was tiring. Not that he didn't like being feared, but it was so boring, always hating stuff. Anakin couldn't help but enjoy his aggressive outbursts, because there was some thrill in it. In his mind, it was like the bad cop routine. No one expected it from a Jedi Knight, but when it came to tall, dark, and gruesome, they absolutely anticipated his wrath. It took out the joy of anger, which is ironic to say, but it was the truth. Vader wanted his anger to feel like it had some sort of value, and as a Sith, it had very little aside from serving the dark side. It was a useful asset, but was it fully worthwhile? As of now, Vader didn't believe so. Eventually, he found a shuttle coated in moss. The Jedi had been here for 3 planetary weeks, and went out of their way to hide the vessel. According to the scouts he ran into before, they were bringing younglings from the Purge to their cache and protecting them. It was clear that the Jedi Knights, or Masters present, didn't know that they were being followed, but they had done a fine job by choosing a planet so far removed from the core. It was just a shame for them because the Empire's resources were nearly limitless. Vader used the Force to crush a couple of door panels as he entered, making sure that the Jedi had a harder time adjusting to the noise. What he didn't expect was to see assassin droids. It turns out the Jedi stole this vessel from a pirate, and they had a squad of droids. The weaponized clankers fired at him, and Vader used the Force to stop their blasts with his hand, while also crushing their bodies with the Force and continuing down the hallway. Just following these kills, Vader ascended to an electrical hallway. It wasn't easy to walk around in, but it was far from a crawl space, tall enough that he could actually walk in it straight up. The Dark Lord wanted to avoid detection, and thanks to the assassin droids, the entire vessel was beaming with alarms. The 4 Jedi present inside the ship moved from their meditation chambers to confront the intruder. They assumed it was an Inquisitor, and if not that, then hopefully just TK troopers. As the 4 of them turned the corner, they speedily marched down the hallway, looking for a sign of the individual who located them. At the helm of the ship was a pilot droid, preparing to lift off per their instructions. Just as they closed in on the entrance to the ship, a creature dropped from the ceiling. They readied their weapons and prepared to fight the Sith Lord. They couldn't believe it. Vader could. As he approached, he thrusted his hand outward, catching the Zabrak in his grip, blocking the Togruta and killing them in one strike. A human and a Rodian came next after he killed the Zabrak, with the deflection and gripping of another wrist. The snap of the Rodian's forearm could be heard until his neck snapped back against the walls from a forced push. Vader turned down towards the weakened opponent and executed him as well. The Sith Lord felt disappointed. These foolish Jedi weren't much of a challenge, but that had become the chase in the last few months, since the Purge started. Darkness covered the galaxy. It had done that since the Clone War, but now it was too much for any one Jedi to handle. These 4 tried to unite themselves, but they weren't prepared for Vader. As it turned out, the Togruta was the Jedi Master of the group, and the other 3 being Jedi Knights. He looked through their bodies before finding the keys that were referenced by Sidious. As Vader collected the artifacts and the 4 kyber crystals held by the Jedi, the vessel started to lift off. The engines needed to warm up because it was an older ship, and a pirate one at that. Now that the ship was rising off of the surface, Vader smashed into the wall. He forced his way along the corridors of the rising craft, before cutting through the door to the bridge and dismantling the pilot droid. That immediately became a problem, because the droid was in complete control over the ship, and thus, once he was gone, it dropped out of the sky. Vader didn't really have time to react before the ship cratered into the surface of the jungle. Fire erupted around the Sith Lord, and he held on to his life, but shoving the keys and crystals into his stomach to protect them. When the trip to the surface and explosion ended, he rose from the fires, this time unscathed. His armor was slightly dented. Pieces of his metallic arms and legs were showing, not to mention a deep incision in his soft upper body piece. But Vader stepped away from the fires and out from the bridge. When he exited, he looked around and saw something that had been hidden. As it turns out, the Jedi came to Dala because the cache was built into the jungle itself. The pirate ship stolen by the Jedi was used to cover the trace of the cache. The Jedi believing that the intruders inside the ship were the only ones on the planet, and so they prepared to leave, just in case they couldn't defend themselves. They just happened to die before the vessel could depart into hyperspace. Vader looked down at the ramparts of the cache. Some were stone pillars with a light wooded roof to protect the interior from getting clobbered by rainstorms. The fires of the destroyed craft started rippling out across the trees, and Vader realized that he needed to find the holocron his master was looking for, before this place burned to the ground too. He jumped over the edge and onto the roof, before falling through it. His body was too heavy, and Vader crashed down into the surface, slamming into the ground and looking around in almost a dazed and surprised manner. This entire trip to Dala had been a bizarre mess, and now he was annoyed. He pressed on his knees to stand up, but through the thick cover of his breathing apparatus, he could hear a whimpering. Vader's eyes closed and he sensed around himself. He could feel fear, but how could that be? If the 4 Jedi were all that were here, then it clicked. The trooper suspected potential younglings, and without even a hint of hesitation, his crimson saber shot out of his hilt, the red glow covering the floor and his dark robes. Vader needed the extra light anyways, but that fear was something to feed off of. His master taught him to use the fear of those weaker than him to empower himself. The Jedi younglings, like they had inside the temple, cowered in fear. His weapon slashed through tables in the way, and he knocked over bookshelves. Most of these books were old ones made out of physical paper, not the most common type of book inside the archives on Coruscant. The keys Vader held in his hand weren't going to fit any of these books, so he had to keep looking. He kept his eyes peeled for any sight of the enemy Jedi, but they didn't reveal themselves. They remained hidden, though they were getting closer. One of the younglings told his peers to take the artifact and run. If they had to burn it in the fire, then they had to do it, but he told them to run. The boy was the eldest of the group, which was 11. He had been told by his supposed-to-be future master to protect the artifact. The Togruta, Master Shala, hadn't given him much instructions in saving them, but protect the artifact is what he told them to do following Order 66 and any potential discovery. The boy rushed out of the crevice as the other 3 kids rushed away. His green saber ignited and he yelled, swinging at Vader. The Dark Lord turned around, waving his hand and launching the tawny body off of his feet and into the wall. He wheezed in pain as Vader looked around, hearing the scrambling of other feet. His saber lifted from his hand and was launched across the chamber, slamming into the wall, missing. The children screamed, but they were spared by his miss. Vader pulled the saber back into his hand and deignited it, using the force to raise the other youngling into his hand and drag them kicking and screaming as he stormed after the others. Vader told the child to reveal where the data was, and the kid, with limited ability to speak, told him to choke on his respirator. The Dark Lord therefore crushed his windpipe and tossed him across the room, before turning the corner and sensing the children hiding nearby. He could see one of their feet sticking out, but he decided to enjoy this moment some more. Vader's heavy boots slowly placed themselves onto the ground. He paced towards them, feeling their heart rate rise more and more. Their terror was his pride. As Vader walked past them, he turned on a heel and faced their direction. They believed he didn't see them, and were quickly shuffling out of the way so they could make it into the jungle. But the 3rd child fell over when she looked back at him. His hands were placed on his hips, and he just stared, without making a sound aside from his apparatus breathing. They screamed in terror. The child with the holocron dropped it, and falling on it by accident, Vader's saber ignited, and stormtroopers near miles away could hear the echoes of screams, surrounded by the blast of the fire. The Sith Lord pulled the holocron out of their bodies and held it, accessorizing it and plugging a key into it. The device peeled open and revealed a series of portals across the galaxy. Though the irony of such a holocron is that it did not have the full answer. Instead, it required a collection, only known to the already dead lead archivist Jocasta Nu. Master Shala was wise to keep these separated. Perhaps Jocasta Nu's own cache had similar resources. What Vader didn't know is that what he had discovered was Sidious' first step towards uniting the world between worlds and entering it, so that he could claim ultimate power in the galaxy. Vader closed the holocron and planted everything on his belt, and started walking around the cache. The fires hadn't reached the surface of the location, likely because it was hidden underground. It was a buried location, and it was quite the drop from the surface. He continued marching around, looking through books and holocrons before eventually finding something that piqued his interest. It was data from former Counselor Eth Koth. The Iridonian Zabrak left the High Council before the end of the war. That wasn't true. Obi-Wan told Anakin that Eth and the Council had disagreements, the body forcing their fellow master to step down. Eth Koth left the Order due to disillusionment with the Jedi Order. He was now dead, thanks to Vader killing him a few weeks before arriving on Dola. Anakin never truly did know why he left the Order, though Vader was very interested in this document, pondering if it had anything to do with what Eth had said to the Council. He remembered Obi-Wan being quite quiet about the whole thing, but this was a chance to learn something new. Vader would leave the planet before the troopers ever interacted with him again, and he would deliver the holocron to his Emperor. Sidious didn't have anything for him to do, so he sent his apprentice back to Mustafar until he had something useful for him. This was a tactic used by the Emperor to encourage Vader to remain complacent. If he could sit in silence and seethe over not having control, then he could effectively be controlled by the Emperor. The issue was making sure it made sense, but the apprentice hadn't questioned it yet. Sidious had plenty of countermeasures to make sure nothing came up. He didn't need Vader getting testy with him. So after traveling to the Outer Rim, then to the Deep Core, Vader was forced back into hyperspace, so that he could once again return to the Outer Rim. The volcanic world was even further away from Coruscant, so it was a grueling trip back and forth for him. When he arrived, he spent most of the next few days inside of the Bacta tanks. He didn't even bother reading through the holocron he took from Eth Koth. Part of him feared Sidious learning about it, and he knew that if he lied, he could get caught. So it was best in his mind to avoid looking at the device. Sidious didn't know, nor did he care, because it didn't carry information on the world between worlds. What it did hold, though, was information that Eth Koth had started gathering prior to the Clone War. Vader would find this information after his 4th day on Mustafar, and it would confuse him greatly, but interest him more. As it turned out, following the entire situation on Quen in 33 BBY, Eth Koth became disenchanted with the will of the Council, to a degree. It wasn't a big thing like Dooku made it out to be, but it was a lurking problem for him. As Vader listened and read, Eth Koth compiled information on the past of the Jedi by visiting a multitude of other Jedi outposts around the galaxy. He learned about individuals who lived in harmony with the Jedi Code, but also explored other routes of living with the Force. It was through this that Master Koth created the Grey Initiative. He had practiced it more after leaving the Order, but it was lost to time because he had sent it to Dala with Master Shala before the first year of the Clone War ended. Vader contemplated these ideas, because they spoke to him personally. The Force was a mystical power, and every time he leaned on the light during his recovery, he felt a little better. This didn't automatically heal him, but he felt better, which helped him a lot. The dark side, as he had thought earlier on Dala, was an annoying itch. It was only completed by feeling empty, and if you're always striving for a higher level of emptiness, then can you really ever become completed? Vader considered the possibilities of combining both the Jedi and the Sith ways. He loathed the way of the Jedi, and he would hunt down and kill every single last one of them. But what if, in the era of Empire, a new unit could be forged, a new path could be created? It sounded optimistic, but the Jedi and Sith were terrible for the galaxy. Anakin never cared for the Sith, and this carried on to his current life. Vader was loyal to his master. He didn't care about the Sith path nearly as much, because to him, it was his master who saved him on Mustafar. At least he made himself believe that Palpatine had. So if the Emperor was an ally, then they could utilize their bond to start something new. They weren't obeying the rule of two anyways, so why continue to follow it? This could be their path to expanding the way of the Sith, and sure, giving Sidious his everlasting empire. Vader found, especially since Mustafar, that the Sith way had cost him his life. If it weren't for the pull of the Sith, he wouldn't have made such a faulty move against his master. If it weren't for the lessons of the Jedi, he wouldn't have felt the need to prove himself better than Kenobi. So, in his mind, to combine these different aspects of the Force was to expand his mind and his abilities. To use the light and the dark was to complete himself. Thanks in part to the holocron Eth Koth created, there was a full set of rules and instructions that were to be used as guidelines. These rules weren't as rigid as those of the High Council, but they would allow Vader the chance to transition into his state of grayness, which is what he wished to do. All the apprentice could think about was how he could utilize the Force best for himself. He hadn't fully gotten around to craving total power in the galaxy. Sure, he had it on Mustafar to Padme, and that was because of his plans to kill Palpatine, but it was also due to his state of delusional madness. He couldn't get past himself, which is why he failed against Kenobi. But here, Vader could empower himself mentally, physically, and spiritually with the Force to become the best version of himself. The next few months of Vader's life would be in the continuation of this. While he served his master and did obsolete tasks of retrieval like a hellhound, he spent his free time working on his connection to the Force. What he came to learn about this gray side of the Force is that it didn't properly align with anything. It was more akin to what Qui-Gon Jinn was, while remaining a Jedi Master. In this, Vader felt connection back to his one true instructor, the one he should have had. The resentment to Kenobi hadn't yet vanished, but neither Anakin nor Vader held any rage for Qui-Gon Jinn. During this time, Vader killed a number of people, probably close to 60 or so, not much more. So in his transformation, he on the outside didn't seem all that different. Sidious wasn't very concerned as he was visiting scientific bases on Setron, Wayland, and Jakku. A lot of his own work had him focused, so he let Vader continue in his silence. Though despite killing several people, some in even more horrendous methods than those on Dola, he started to buckle. The light side of the Force was gifting him more peace, while the dark side was allowing him to grow in his power. He related it to the inverse of Mace Windu. The Jedi Master of the Order was centralized in the light, but utilized darkness to find shatter points against his opponents. Vader, on the other hand, was centralized in darkness, but used the light to give himself more comfort in his own body. It was something that benefited him more than just seething all the time. When he followed his master's instruction, he found that he was sacrificing his peace. The guilt for Padme's death rode him into the dirt, and he couldn't truly rest most nights. But in this transformative few months, he could sleep without nightmares. He could swallow in the peace and enjoy his solitude, even on Mustafar. This led to a conflict for Skywalker, because he had seen his master as a true friend. Even though Palpatine wasn't able to help him save Padme, he promised his friend to aid him throughout this process, which had been mostly true. Vader was curious if he might be able to convince his current instructor to join him. This worried Vader though, because Sidious could see Anakin's devotion to the Grey as a threat to Imperial rule, but in his heart of hearts, Anakin just wanted to rid the galaxy of the Jedi and the Sith. To become a Grey Boken or a Grey Jedi, they could remove this dogmatic structure of the Dead Orders, while testing the limits of the Force together. Vader didn't care for the titles of the Sith, and sure, Vader was cool as hell, he found more interest in expanding his mind to being more man than machine, despite what his physical features showed of him. After much meditation on this, Anakin made a decision. And yes, that was the irony of Vader's shifting mindset, is that in the process of becoming a Grey Jedi, he was more a Jedi than he ever was during his career in the Old Order. Slowly, his efforts were becoming more equatable to that of the Boken Jedi. When Sidious requested his apprentice from Mustafar, Vader made a show of himself readily. It was here for the first time where he sported a look that went against the original design of his suit. Anakin figured it would prove his point to his master. If he could perhaps show that he had changed in a positive way, then he could maybe encourage his instructor to join him down this path. Sidious was flabbergasted when he saw Vader for the first time. They'd obviously spoken over hologram in the past few months, but he hadn't seen this iteration of his apprentice ever before. The usually fast responder with a quick mind just stared at Anakin with confusion, his pale skin reflecting even Sidious's shriveled body and color. But the wrinkles of electricity weren't present. Skywalker didn't address the obvious change to his body or his suit. He just knelt there, waiting for his master to speak to him. The look wasn't all that different, to be honest. Vader removed his helmet and wore a respirator that attached to his mouth. It was semi-similar to the style that Darth Malgus used thousands of years beforehand. Sidious just blinked, and moved around his desk, and sat down, his hands clasped together, and he asked his student to explain this current look. Anakin looked from side to side and took a seat in front of his Emperor, and sighed, his expressions so visible, which after several months of being hidden was really weird for Anakin. Vader tapped his metallic fingers on his chair and explained that he wanted to try and change things up. Sidious responded with a confused, "Change things up?" To which Vader pouted his face and nodded his head, with some giddiness. Palpatine's jaw hung open, and Anakin pointed at it, warning that he might swallow a fly. The Dark Lord of the Sith just sat perplexed. What was happening right now? Anakin's shoulders bounced, informing his mentor that they were having a meeting. That's what was happening right this second. Sidious's brows firmed, but in a confused manner, not an angry one, just questioning. He then questioned some more, trying to dig into why his student had gone down this route. Vader explained everything, going through the whole dark side being bland thing, his excitement to trying something out, and then why he was so desperate to change his appearance. He did also explain that absolutely none of this was in rebellion to Palpatine's ways. He was just looking to switch himself up some. Anakin even went as far to tell his mentor that he wanted him to join him in this realm. Vader expressed that anger was so boring and tiresome. This was truthfully really bizarre for the Sith Lord, because his entire life had been about abusing the rule of two. He never truly followed it. When he was an apprentice, he had Maul as an assassin. When Tyrannus was a student, there was Savage and Asajj, not to mention the swarm of Inquisitors that now served their ranks. But still, why betray the Sith for the way of the Grey? Anakin just expressed that it wouldn't change anything for them, which is what Palpatine's gripe was. It literally didn't differentiate anything in their lives. The Sith were in control. What point would it make to become Grey? Well, Anakin started talking about the usefulness of the light, perhaps even suggesting that Palpatine loosen his reins on the dark side so that he could heal himself. These thoughts were egregious, preposterous, and ridiculous. He told Vader to snap out of it or he would force him to, and he was cut off from finishing his sentiment. That right there is what Vader was talking about. This behavior was so toxic and boring and bland. Anakin reached forward and touched the desk, telling Palpatine that they had been at odds since he fell on Mustafar. There was tension, but he was his longest mentor, someone who cared over him ever since he arrived on Coruscant. Wouldn't it mean something to continue down that path? They had forged so much together. Surely they could continue exploring the routes of the Force without having to be so edgy all the time. It was so heartwarming that Palpatine said no. He laughed a little, then he said no again, but then heaving up a heavy chuckle. In all fairness, it was quite funny to ask the Dark Lord of the Sith to be a little less dark, but still, Palpatine held his stomach for a moment and then stood up, telling Vader that these radical ideas weren't for the Sith. They were for the Jedi, or some random group of priests. Vader stood up too, getting Palpatine to be a little defensive, but it didn't result in any action. Anakin told his mentor that they weren't going to follow a code. They could live by their own, access both the light and the dark without punishing themselves for nothing good. Anakin pointed out the window, expressing that his loyalty to darkness would only push the Force to respond with hostility, but if they could unite in the Grey, they could forever stand. Mentor and demented. Mentor and student. Sidious thought it was a stupid idea, but it was so stupid that he would humor it, just because he could respect the pain that it likely caused a student to be out in the open, as he was. Ironically, it didn't hurt him all that much, but Sidious didn't need to know that. Palpatine would take the holocron that Master Ethkoth left behind, and study it, just for the hell of it, while Vader played more errand boy again. Interestingly enough, as it might be, for the next few months, following more time of Vader doing more mundane tasks, Sidious found a fondness of these Grey teachings. They were unique, and in his own way, he felt more unlimited power by reaching into the light. It was an extension, one so powerful it gifted him more abilities. The sickness of the dark side, the peace that consumed the Sith for eternity, was their constant lust for power. The Grey that Vader introduced to Palpatine consumed the rage he felt. This, like Vader, didn't stop him from committing acts of evil or tormenting people in the galaxy, but it, for Palpatine, unlike Vader, healed his mind. Much of Vader's use of the Grey was in healing himself, mostly physically, allowing the Force to bind scars with tissue, letting the medical magic of Bacta do what it was meant to do. If submerged in the dark side, Vader would only heal so much, and his pain would have been amplified. But now he was feeling looser, more like the Anakin Skywalker he was before Mustafar. There was still pain, but it was blossoming into individual growth, the same of which could be said for Palpatine. The Sith Lord first felt the light when he read through Eth's work. It was much different than anything he had ever experienced. The light, for Palpatine, was painful, but it was the sheer shock of what life could be like in any other circumstance. Sidious became addicted to touching the light, and then became enveloped by it, because all of his interest was in the Force. Palpatine wanted immortality, alchemy, or the world between worlds, but those such things could best be achieved through harmony with the light. In the mind of the Sith Lord, he could release his grip on anger and power, so that he could fuel himself with the light and use that gift to take even more control in the galaxy. But see, the funny thing is, once he let go of the darkness, he no longer craved power like he did as a Sith. So when Vader returned from multiple missions, his mentor told him to come along. They'd be going on a retreat together. The two former Sith would find themselves enjoying life for a moment. Those moments multiplied, becoming days of enjoyment. These were Force-focused missions, where they would use the Force to expand themselves. The great Plagueis the Wise tried for more than a century to unlock these powers or gifts, and Sidious had done so much in mere months because he let the dark out and replaced it with light. But due to his hyper-focus, he found it hard to even find the dark side of the Force once it was gone. He obsessed with the Force, and Vader's, or Eth's gray side, had introduced him to everything he had longed for his entire life. This came especially from the fact that he had already achieved the most power in the galaxy. As Emperor, there was no next level, aside from intergalactic dominance, which would take eons to complete. So the greatest high for Palpatine was simply experiencing the Force through a different lens, because he had already experienced his greatest political high. This, after a few retreats for Palpatine and Vader, became the change that would set the Empire down a completely different route. Sidious instructed Mustafar to take control over the Senate. As a yes man, the Senate would be able to eventually conform Mas to work with them, and delegate more power into their hands. This would come in clutch before Tarkin or Krennic got their greedy militaristic hands wrapped around the Senate's throats. Palpatine's relinquishment of power would give the Senate the chance to rule again without someone presiding over their every move with absolute power. It was in this that Sidious rapidly embraced the Grey, and told Vader that they were to destroy the light and the dark altogether. Their target became Jedi and Sith. If those individuals wanted to serve with them, then they could, but their objective was to cleanse the galaxy. The Force was the gift of the universe, and it must be shared by those willing to embrace all its aspects, not just the dogmatic, narrow view of the Jedi or the Sith. Anakin was taken aback by how invested Palpatine had become, but he had droned throughout his entire life, for nearly decades, looking for the next best thing. Killing Savage and torturing Maul was awesome. Order 66 was fantastic, but it just became boring at a certain point. The dark side could only take his alchemy so far, and he saw that with Plagueis. Now, he could go further than ever before. In this, Sidious treated Anakin like a true friend, with actual care. He was eternally grateful that Skywalker opened him up to this pathway. Because of this gray path, Sidious would use the Inquisitors to locate Maul, and the two former Sith Lords would find the leader of Crimson Dawn on the planet of Sullust. Most of the Inquisitors would conform to the Grey Way, while those who didn't would fight with Maul and lose their lives in pursuit of victory against Palpatine, Skywalker, and the other Inquisitors, i.e., the impossible fight. During this speed run of destroying off sects of non-Grey users, Palpatine came up with an idea. He thought that they should call their sect the Grey Jedi. Now, I know everyone thinks this might be far-fetched, but Palpatine thought it'd be ironic. See, he, as a former Sith, loved the idea of both bashing the order he swore his life to, but also the religious group that he hated his entire life. In the destruction of the Sith, a new group of Jedi would rise, and in the ashes of the old order, a lifelong Sith would do the Jedi path better than the actual Jedi did. That's why it was funny to Sheev, because he was saying screw you to both sides while saying that he could do it better than the Jedi, than Yoda, than anyone that came before them. And the truth is, it worked for this group. They continued moving about, studying the Force, killing off Jedi who didn't turn, and welcoming in those who did. It was a weird mesh of change, but because Anakin was the master behind this great shift, his friend Palpatine elicited control over the Grey sect to his good friend. This was something that also greatly rewarded Anakin. He found belonging with Palpatine for the first time since after Order 66. They were acting almost like father and son. So for Skywalker, it was the greatest thing ever. Outside of their grand adventures, the Empire would slow its military machine as power returned to the Senate. They'd fix up their government before it got too corrupt, and delegate resources to entities to help people rather than bury them under oppression. The years that followed Palpatine's disappearance would be some of the best years of Sheev's life. The Grey Jedi moved as a unit, and they also had a luxury liner that they used, because Palpatine was still in good relations with the Imperial government. Masameda basically gave him whatever he wanted, with an unlimited budget, with his unlimited power. See, Palpatine and his Grey Jedi became a cult, in a way. They were hyper-obsessed with the Force and all of its possibilities. So when Sheev found the world between worlds, for example, he didn't crush the timeline like he wanted to initially do. Instead, he used it to learn more about the Force, because there were things that had been lost to the ancients. The generational game of telephone doesn't always last forever, and thus, the world between worlds became the greatest avenue to accessing power. During this time, Vader's suit would be fixed, so that it didn't cause him any more pain. And for Anakin, despite running with the Grey Jedi, he would find his other family. Ahsoka was among many to find interest in this path. She wasn't in agreement with Palpatine being involved, but unlike Yoda, she was willing to give it a try. The Grand Master would be killed by a swarm of Grey Jedi, who accidentally found him when following Anakin and Sheev when they followed the Force priestesses from the Wellspring of Life to Dagobah. They hoped that it would bring peace, but it did not, because Yoda would not change his ways, so he died. Obi-Wan was a much different experience, because he wouldn't join nor die. He wasn't really interested in either option, and he was left to continue on his own path without the Jedi, though he did have some sense of completion because of Anakin's semi-return. The Grey Jedi, more than anything, acted more like vigilantes rather than villainous beings, like the Sith would've. Without fear of a moral code, they just did as they pleased. They were rich, thanks to Palpatine, but they also had individuals with morals. The sect voted on actions. Like Anakin very personally hated slavers, so they voted on acting against them, which won, because Ahsoka and Palpatine sided with Skywalker. Sheev more so cared about Anakin's wants than the lives of the slavers. This became common as the group grew, adding more members, young and old, to their ranks. Eventually, after years of nomad lifestyle, the Grey Jedi would settle in on the hidden world of Brendok, where a Virgins in the Force was located. Combining Anakin, who was himself a Virgins, and the planet, allowed the Grey Jedi to utilize the mysticisms of the Force to accomplish amazing things. Wonders in the Force not seen since the ones reigned from Mortis were seen. Skywalker, as the proclaimed Chosen One, had brought balance to the Force, being that he had saved the Jedi and Sith, bringing them together as one. The Grey Jedi sect would remain on Brendok, using the old mining facility and building from it a temple of their own. It would give them the ability to construct a training grounds, a portal to the world between worlds, and other great wonders that would leave generations in awe of the combined power of Palpatine and Skywalker. Over the years, Anakin would eventually reunite with his children and bring them to Brendok, where they could find home with a larger family of Force users. Being that they allowed individuals to have families, it was very common for the sect to add members just by having families with children. Luke and Leia were introduced before their teens, so they fell in love with it, and they did with their father as well. Ahsoka and Palpatine were great to have around, and even Ahsoka came around to respecting Sheev for at least making the dedication to change. But with Palpatine, as it was for the other former Darksiders, the Grey Path was one that allowed them to heal their inner selves, while expanding their outer. This community gave belonging to many people who never had it before, and while Palpatine was known for lusting after hate, he couldn't find it within himself anymore. In using the light side and the dark side, Anakin Skywalker had brought unity to millenniums of conflict across the stars, all done in one united Grey Jedi Order. And that, my friends, is a pretty wholesome PP story for you all. Special thanks to the patrons: Benjamin Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Jack Silver, There Are Cars, The Shade of Fear, Prismatic Warlock Master, Lyndall Asher, Schmoobs, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot 36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, General Alexander, Robin Roberts, Blackie Chan, Alexander Arisa Beginning and End, Django Fat Clone, Nick 5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pyramark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir Well 1767, Darth Revan, Granddaddy Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Wee 670, Annika Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Jedi Naguin, Zanza Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calig, Youngling Slayer 66, Magnetic Studios, Anakin 003, Lord Draken, Fortis Legacy Star Wars, Airbus, Rex the Wolf, the main three first names, Dark Saint 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Another wholesome PP story. Let's talk about the wholesome PPs. So, this is cool. I originally was gonna kill Palpatine, yeah, and then I was like, well, what if it was like really wholesome? And it's like really wholesome. Overall, I really wanted to have this vibe of Anakin and Palpatine, kind of having that what if Palpatine actually cared about Anakin vibe. I did that a while back. One of my favorite types of story to tell is Palpatine turning to the light, and I think in this scenario it works with him turning to the light. The reason I think it does is because he's already accomplished everything. He's not reached immortality yet, duh, but he's reached everything politically. He's destroyed the Jedi, he's the Emperor, he has absolute control over everything. So I think he would humor it. I don't think he would get into it. I think he would just humor it, because what's the worst that could happen? You know, Vader's not a threat to him. What's going to happen if he just plays around with it for a little bit? And that's why he kind of just conforms, because he doesn't expect to kind of lose his interest in the dark side once he lets go of it. And so that was like the really fun aspect of that switch and change, because it's like this story starts off the darkest of the dark, and then it's like super wholesome at the end. So that was really what I wanted to go for here instead of killing Palpatine. It starts off really dark, and then it's like, oh, that's like really happy. It's like a good time. You know, you got a whole family here. You got Palpatine, you got Ahsoka, you got Anakin, you got the twins. They're just having a good time, and they're doing things. So I hope you all enjoy the story. I love you all. Spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the wholesome pee-pee